From the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., welcome to Kennan X, a podcast on our never-ending quest to understand Russia, Ukraine, and the surrounding region. I'm your host, Jill Doherty. For anyone who watches Russia, there's no more intoxicating expression than top secret. Secrets, government secrets, classified information, eyes-only documents are the most valuable commodity of all. The Russian government and the U.S. government employ every protection they can to keep them locked up from the other government and often from their own citizens. The National Security Archive calls itself an indexer and publisher of former secrets. It's an independent, nonprofit, non-governmental organization founded in 1985 by journalists and scholars to check rising U.S. government secrecy. Its archive, according to the Los Angeles Times, is the world's largest non-governmental collection of declassified U.S. documents, billions of them, that the archive pried out of government hands thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. For Russia watchers, it's a goldmine of information. And my guests today on Kennan X are Tom Blanton, who's director of the National Security Archive, and Svetlana Savranskaya. She is a senior analyst who focuses on the Soviet Union and Russia. So welcome, Tom and Svetlana.
Pleasure to be with you, Jill.
Thank you.
I'm so glad. This really is going to be fun. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start with what the archive actually is. I know that it's housed actually not very far away from where I am right now at George Washington University in Foggy Bottom here in Washington, D.C., but it's also a digital archive. And our podcast listeners can actually go on your website. They can search for everything from the Cuban Missile Crisis to NATO to Putin, even to a rather strange encounter between Elvis and Nixon, which I won't get into in this podcast, but it's pretty fascinating. So I have this image of a long, dark corridor full of boxes of classified documents. So, Tom, maybe we begin with you. Can you explain actually the process? How do you get these documents?
Well, Jill, we look for references to documents in the press every day. If the president or the secretary of defense is having a phone call with the Russian defense minister, there's almost certainly going to be a prep document with some talking points and a transcript of what was actually said. Or if President George W. Bush is going to meet with President Putin in Sochi, a whole summit meeting, there'll be multiple briefing papers and talking points and transcripts, memcons, or telephone calls after. So that's the grist for our mill. Those precise moments in time become the subject of focused Freedom of Information requests. We also have a secret sauce, which is we look for when top officials leave the government, there's a process where they retire their files. Most of them don't have a country club down in Florida where they can take the boxes of classified documents and stash them in the bathroom at Mar-a-Lago, but there's a process of retirement, and those lists of retired files have been a real key to the vast universe of government records. Svetlana has used that to extraordinary degree to get the Strobe Talbot documents released.
I want to get into that, but just one quick question. How do you decide what shouldn't be declassified? I mean, it must be like kids in a candy store. You'd like everything, but there are some things that perhaps should not be revealed to either the public or to the enemy.
I think that's right, but the government leans so far in the other direction. It's a knee-jerk response. It's mostly driven by bureaucratic imperatives, fear of embarrassment. The real secrets are a tiny fraction. The real secrets, like a diagram of a chemical binary warhead or a bottom line in a negotiation that we're doing right now, say with the Iranians or the Israelis, or the identity of a human source in Burma or China who talks to the embassy or the CIA station and be shot if that was released. There are real secrets, but our experience with literally millions of declassified documents and leaked documents is that's a small fraction, maybe 20% of the total universe. The other 80% should get released for history, for accountability, but it doesn't get released unless we fight for it through freedom of information requests and lawsuits.
Yeah, really interesting. Svetlana, let's go to you. Tom was just mentioning you were able to get Strobe Talbot's files from the 1990s declassified. And of course, everyone on this podcast knows he was Bill Clinton's Russia hand, Deputy Secretary of State, and first ambassador to the newly independent states after the breakup of the Soviet Union. These are really key documents. And you've pointed this out. It was really a balancing act at the time, engaging with Russia, but also expanding NATO. So I guess, Svetlana, what was the most important insight that you gained?
There are two insights. One about declassification. Of course, sometimes people told me that going after all the documents that Strobe Talbot created or crossed his desk on Russia would be too ambitious. But in fact, that's exactly what I did. And I worked with the retired files at Suitland, which is the national storage of retired files. They're secret. It's very hard to understand how to orient there. But I was very lucky because I had the book, the Russia hand, so I was able to request the documents that Strobe Talbot used in the book. So this is in terms of insight for declassification, aim very high, and you might get not everything you want, but a lot. And the insight into the substantive story of the documents, I think, looking at what I got, and these are thousands and thousands of pages on the 1990s, I can see that although the Clinton administration was probably the best intentioned administration toward Russia, the president really cared, Strobe Talbot really cared. They were so committed to the Russian democratic transition, but at the same time, they had mixed priorities. They couldn't figure out which priority was number one. Was it building democracy in Russia? Was it market reform in Russia? Was it control of nuclear weapons, control and destruction of nuclear weapons? Or was it NATO expansion? So they tried to do everything together, saying that in the end, Russia will accept NATO expansion, and in return, Russia will become a partner of the United States. But all these things together resulted in foreign policy that ultimately did not take Russian security concerns seriously. That's at least from the point of view of the Russian interlocutors, Russian political leadership.
A lot of this is really, it's 20, 30 years ago, but it's very aktualna, as we say. It's very actual, immediate, and has real resonance for today. And Tom, I'm thinking with Putin's war against Ukraine, you've got that incredible history of how Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons back then. And this debate that's really on fire about whether it should have done that. If they had nuclear weapons, maybe they wouldn't have been attacked by Russia, et cetera. You know this debate. And then, of course, Russia is claiming that it was forced to disarm when it was, quote, on its knees. So if we were in the debate society here, what any new insights on that huge fight that really is going on as we speak?
What I'm struck by reading through the documents is how none of the countries involved, except maybe Kazakhstan, actually gets the extraordinary success for world security that the 1990s denuclearization, the consolidation and dramatic reduction in nuclear weapons, what a success story that was. And it came from the direct hands-on cooperation of the Russian military, American military, Ukrainian military, Russian scientists, American scientists, Ukrainian and Kazakh scientists. The net effect was to make all of us safer enhancing the security, I would say, of Russia, the United States, and at the time, Ukraine. Because if Ukraine had tried to hold on to its nuclear weapons, it didn't have the capacity to deal with those warheads. They were little Chernobyls waiting to happen. We got one document out of a Russian advisor to Yeltsin who says to Yeltsin, stop bargaining, offering deals, forgiveness of oil and gas debts to those Ukrainians. If you do nothing, those warheads will start to fall apart and the Ukrainians will be begging us to come take them back and take care of them. So Ukraine, I think the people, especially from the outside, Americans who say, oh, Ukraine should never have given up their nuclear weapons, really deny the agency of the Ukrainian decisions in the 1990s. I mean, they were the people who experienced Chernobyl. They had specifically said we're a non-nuclear state when they declared their independence. They looked at what it would have cost to hold on to those nukes and keep the warheads safe and decided they didn't nearly have that money. And they needed to make a deal to make their neighborhoods safer. And as long as it was backed up by the United States and others, it held for 20 years until Russia took back Crimea and started the Donbass War in 2014. So Ukraine got a breathing space. It didn't make as much of that breathing space as it might have in becoming a stronger economy, a stronger, more prosperous democracy, in great contrast to Russia. Multiple elections and changes of power in Ukraine. Look what's happened in Russia.
Mm-hmm. I can't get over the drama of actually reading the documents that you have on your website. I went on and I actually printed one out. I have it right here. It's from October 30th, 1962, which, of course, astute people who listen to this podcast will know immediately was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's a memorandum from Attorney General Robert Kennedy to Secretary of State Dean Rusk about a meeting at the Justice Department at 7:45 a.m. The Russian ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin, was called in. And I'm just going to read quickly this thing because, I mean, here it is. It's an actual photocopy. Down at the bottom, it says top secret. That's crossed off. And then they declassified it. And here's just a little bit. We met in my office. I told him first we understood that the work was continuing on the Soviet missile bases in Cuba. Further, I explained to him that in the last 2 hours, we'd found that our planes flying over Cuba had been fired upon and that one of our U-2s had been shot down and the pilot killed. I said, these men were flying unarmed planes. I told him this was an extremely serious turn in events. We would have to make certain decisions within the next 12 or possibly 24 hours. There was very little time left. If the Cubans were shooting at our planes, then we were going to shoot back. I mean, it doesn't get more dramatic than that. And that is a real document. What is it like? Well, maybe, Tom, you can tell me, because you've been there for so long. What is it like to hold a document in your hand, or maybe, I don't know, see it electronically, and read those words and the real story of what was happening?
Those documents really put you in the room with these policymakers when the existence of human civilization is hanging in the balance. We now know, because of work Svetlana did to bring Russian veterans to conferences in Cuba, that there were tactical nuclear weapons on the ground in Cuba and on submarines at the quarantine line, and that if the United States had done what the generals all proposed doing, which is massive bombing raids, which is taking them out, there would have been the beginning of Armageddon. So these documents, I think, bring us back to that time, restore some of the contingency. It did not have to turn out the way it did. There were many other roads not taken. There were real choices by people like Kennedy backing off the invasion plan, by Khrushchev pulling his boats back from the quarantine line. I mean, there was recklessness on both sides going into the missile crisis, but both those leaders were chastened. And then, of course, you've got the independent variable we now know of Fidel Castro. Svetlana is the world's expert on that.
Boy, any insights, Svetlana, like one big impression that you have from all of the work that you've done on that?
On the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
How little we knew about what was going on. And like Tom pointed out, how important Fidel Castro was. And the third one, how close we came to the real abyss, to the use of tactical nuclear weapons that would probably bring about a response from the United States. So the Cuban Missile Crisis in itself was a whole history of discovery, from the initial statements about eyeball to eyeball and the other blinked, to what we understand now was mutual compromise and a lot of empathy involved between Kennedy and Khrushchev, less so Castro.
That's fascinating. One thing that I was wondering about is, in several instances that I read about, Soviet and Russian officials actually provided documents or cooperated with the U.S., and sometimes providing even more than the Americans had. What about now? Do you have any cooperation with Russia?
No, we don't. In the 1990s, Russian archives were very open, and we worked together on various issues with Organi, the Communist Party Central Committee archive, with the Gorbachev Foundation, and we were able to get documents way earlier than we could get them from the American archives. So we would bring the documents from Russia and then bring them to, say, the Bush Library or the Clinton Library and say, well, we do have these transcripts. We would like to see the American equivalents. Especially, I have to say, the Gorbachev Foundation was our best partner with Anatoly Sergeyevich Chernyaev, who was closest advisor to Gorbachev on foreign policy, not just with us, but with many international researchers. He was very sharing, he was very engaging, and he was kind of the activist of transparency, allowed people to look at the documents. Unfortunately, right now, we do not have access, but if you are in Russia, the archives are open, and there are excellent documents, excellent collections declassified, especially at Organi, the Central Committee archive. The Gorbachev collection is declassified. Andropov, Chernenko, Brezhnev collections are declassified. International department documents are declassified. It's a gold mine.
Wow.
And the problem is simply that going there is extremely risky for any researcher from the West because the judicial system is so arbitrary in Russia today. An editor for Radio Free Europe could just be snatched up when she's visiting her ailing mother and charged with treason and foreign agent roles and sent to prison. So it's a terrible time to try to be a researcher from outside. Russia's doing itself no favors in terms of the world's understanding of Russia's own decision-making.
Sadly. The last question is really not almost a question, but just thoughts. Putin is weaponizing history, as we know. And I think what's wonderful about the National Security Archive is that you can't weaponize the facts. I mean, the facts are the facts. Quotes and documents are there. Now, maybe the person was lying in the document, but these are real facts and factoids. I guess I'm asking you to sum up the work that you do, but you are setting the record straight.
Well, it's a constant struggle, though, because we know as historians and scholars and journalists, there's a constant struggle between memory, the narratives we all create about our own past, versus the evidence of that past. One of the reasons our process works is we bring that evidence and actually challenge people's memories in these critical oral history sessions where you can't get away with just spinning your own story the way you want. But what I'm struck by, and I think the complexities are too great to compress into a single insight or soundbite, but one of the quotes that jumped out at me from one of the transcripts of Bill Clinton meeting with his buddy Boris Yeltsin, and they're talking, and Beale is congratulating Yeltsin on being such a great democratically elected president, and Yeltsin says, well, Beale, you didn't destroy the Soviet Union. I did. We did. You didn't get rid of the Communist Party. I did. We did. And suddenly it makes you look at the end of the Cold War in a different way than what you see in the usual Western literature, the triumphalism. No. It was Russians who destroyed the Soviet Union, while the Americans, according to the documents, were doing everything they could to keep it together. Because we were scared to death of a Yugoslavia with nukes, right? So the documents give you real angles on the history that contradict the conventional wisdom and actually help you understand, as Svetlana said, have some empathy for where the other is coming from.
Yeah.
And I would like to just add on this that unfortunately now, with our inability to go and do research in Moscow, we know less about the way the Russian leadership saw the things, especially in the 2000s. So that's why we like the MEMCONs, the Memoranda of Conversations, so much, because you could hear the voice of the other reflected in the American documents, since we can't get the Russian side of it. And being kind of with these people at this conversation gives you a tremendous insight. You can manipulate documents by picking facts, of course, and people do it all the time on both sides. But we offer these documents to researchers in hope to open a real debate based on facts and not just manipulations or our own theories of how things developed.
Wow, this is really fascinating. I would totally urge anyone who's listening to this just to jump on the website and look around. As we're all saying, it's a gold mine, and it's fascinating. Oh, wait. I have to ask you just 2 seconds on Elvis and Nixon, because that has nothing to do with the Soviet Union, but it's pretty weird.
It just goes to the documents. We found out one of our great staffers was sitting out at the National Archives, and she asked, well, so what copy of a document do Americans ask for more than any other, expecting to hear, oh, the Gettysburg Address, Declaration of Independence, Constitution. No, it was the photograph of Richard Nixon shaking hands with Elvis in the Oval Office in 1970, and that this was the item more people wanted a copy of than any other document.
Wow.
So she's a document fetishist like all of us at the National Security Archive, and she says, well, if they ever let Elvis into the Oval, there must be documents behind that, like somebody approved the meeting. Was there a transcript? And there have to be other photos. Those White House photographers take multiple photos in case the eyes are closed or somebody's looking a little more hungover. So she got the file released. It turned out Elvis showed up at the White House with a handwritten letter asking for a meeting with the president because he wanted to help in the war on drugs. The ironies abound, right? And what he really wanted was a federal badge credential from the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And the White House Appointments Secretary writes the chief of staff, yeah, I think we've got a slot. We could let him in and maybe he could help do a TV special. And besides, if the president wants to meet some bright young people, Elvis would be a good place to start. And H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, writes out to the side, you must be kidding. But he checks yes for letting Elvis in. It goes on, but it's amazing stuff. There's a photograph of Nixon actually looking at Elvis's rhinestone cufflinks. And I just imagine myself, there's Nixon saying, why doesn't Pat ever give me cufflinks like this, right? But it's what the documents and the photographs and the evidence can tell you, can put you there in the room, make it so immediate, and help you reach a more profound understanding of our own history.
Yeah. Well, this has been really great. And thank you very much, Tom Blanton and Svetlana Savranskaya. And thank you very much for all the work that you do at the National Security Archive.
Thank you, Jill, very much.
Thank you.
Kennan X is a product of the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. It's the Wilson Center's oldest program, founded in 1974 by George F. Kennan, American statesman, James Billington, historian and former Librarian of Congress, and historian S. Frederick Starr. Inspired by them, the Kennan Institute's mission is to improve America's understanding of Russia and the wider region. Thanks for listening.